Reproductive hormones can be grouped by three major ways. First, by the source, so where they came from. Um, Second, by their mode of action, how they elicit their response. And third, by their biochemical classification. And so that just refers to like what type of hormone they are, whether they're a steroid or a protein or a fatty acid. So we're going to start learning about these hormones that are important in reproductive function by studying their source classifications. And so this is a busy slide, and we're going to work through each one of these, so don't get too overwhelmed. But when it comes to where hormones actually are secreted from, the tissue that they're actually synthesized in and secreted from to elicit their response later down the line, we are looking at basically five major tissues. And we're going to, most of these are the same for male and female, with the obvious exceptions like the uterus and the placenta. And so hypothalamus is kind of the king and the major regulator of reproductive cyclicity. And the hormone that's going to be associated with the hypothalamus is the gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. The pituitary gland is just generally grouped here, so both the anterior and the posterior lobes. And so the major reproductive hormones associated with the pituitary tissue is LH, or luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, oxytocin, and prolactin. And then in the gonads, both in the male and female, is where the hormones like testosterone, estrogen, which I'm going to call estradiol more often than not, but estrogen, estradiol for your purposes means the same thing. Progesterone, inhibin, and activin are all going to be created or synthesized in the gonads. And prostaglandin is, there's a couple of different types of prostaglandin. Those are synthesized in the uterine tissue. And in the placenta, we will see progesterone, estradiol, equine and human chorion gonadotropin, as well as placental lactogen being synthesized in the placental tissue. So again, when we talk about the source classifications of hormones in reproductive function, it really has to do with these five major tissues that are a key regulator of cyclicity. So in the hypothalamus, the hormone that is most that is is going to be the main regulator is gonadotropin releasing hormone, but there are some other ones that are also involved with this process. And so all the hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus or by neurons in the hypothalamus are classified as a neuropeptide. So neuro meaning brain, and then peptide meaning short or small protein. And the proteins that we see secreted in other body parts, like coming out of the liver or the lung tissue, the uterus, etc., those are going to be bigger proteins. But because we're dealing with neural tissue, so brain tissue, and neurohormones and neurotransmitters, the chemical substance actually has to be really, really small. So in this case, gonadotropin releasing hormone is actually only 10 amino acids long. It's very, very small. And so these neuropeptides actually will cause the release of another peptide from, in the case of GnRH, from the anterior pituitary gland. So again, GnRH is the master regulator of reproductive hormone, and it is a neurohormone. It is released by the neurons in the hypothalamus. Very small. We call it a decapeptide because it's only 10 amino acids in size. When GnRH is synthesized or created in the hypothalamus and secreted into the third ventricle and the hypophyseal portal system that runs between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, it will actually stimulate the gonatotrope cells in the anterior pituitary to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And more specifically, GnRH actually stimulates the release of LH and FSH. So it doesn't only synthesize the creation or the synthesis of LH and FSH, but also the release of it. And that really sets off a whole cascade of reproductive events. So GnRH is controlled by feedback from estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone. And GnRH, for the most part, is similar in structure or identical in most species, specifically mammals. And in the female, gonadotropin releasing hormone actually comes from two areas of the hypothalamus. It comes from the tonic center and the surge center. And that's just in the female. The male is quite different because the male doesn't have a surge center. And so if you remember back to our discussion about free Martinism in chapter 2 and chapter 4, a free Martin is where we have a set of twins. One is a bull calf, one is a heifer calf. And in utero or in gestation, that they share a similar hormonal environment. And so when the male gonads start producing testosterone, testosterone actually will cross the blood-brain barrier and neutralize the surge center. And so that happens in the males as well. The testosterone will neutralize the surge center in males, so they're born without a surge center, but they do have a tonic center. And so that is one of the biggest differences between the male and the female brain, is the multiple areas that GnRH is produced in the brain. So our tonic center in the hypothalamus is when it synthesizes and secretes GnRH, it does so like a constant drip. So if you've ever had like a faucet that leaks, it just does a constant drip, 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 drip. It never stops. And so that's a really good analogy to how the tonic center actually works. And so when progesterone or P4 is increasing, then we can actually see a slight decrease in the drip rate. But when progesterone is decreasing, we can see an increase in the drip rate. And so in the tonic center, those GnRH neurons are a little bit responsive to progesterone, either increasing or decreasing. And so GnRH that's produced from the tonic center will control follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone release, the release rate and the levels in the blood. The flip side of this in the female is the surge center. So in the hypothalamus, the surge center is really similar to like a hot water faucet. And so when it's turned on full bore. And the surge center, the neurons in the surge center are really responsive to increasing amounts of estradiol or E2, which will then result in a surge of GnRH being released from the hypothalamus and targeting the anterior pituitary. And so this is a threshold level of estradiol that is required for this surge to take place, and this is why we call it the surge center. When we see an increasing amount of progesterone, the surge center will actually turn off production of GnRH. So progesterone is definitely a big regulator in both the tonic and the surge center, but estradiol is really only has major responses in the surge center. As we shift down to the next tissue, so the pituitary gland sits right below the hypothalamus in the head of the individual. And as we talked about in chapter 4, the pituitary hormone or the pituitary gland is made up of two lobes. So the anterior pituitary originates from the roof of the mouth, and it's responsible for synthesizing and secreting follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. whereas the posterior pituitary originates from the brain tissue and pulls neurons down with it. And so, from a reproductive standpoint, the posterior pituitary is a key tissue for the release of oxytocin, not the synthesis of it, but the release of it. And so oxytocin is a really small hormone as well. It's only 9 amino acids long, synthesized in the hypothalamus, but pushed into the blood system by the dendrites that end in the posterior pituitary. And so we can also see oxytocin be produced by the corpus luteum on the gonad as well in females. So oxytocin has a lot of different functions. One of the main ones is that it is the hormone for milk letdown. And so we also know that oxytocin can play a role in luteolysis, so the lysing of the CL. It also plays a role in uterine contractions, which are important for parturition and estrus. And this is actually really a key part or a key thing for producers. If we have a female that is like her water is broke, but she's not really going through contractions, and we need to help push labor along a little bit, we can give an injection of oxytocin to help kickstart that process. And so oxytocin will bind to a few different cells depending on what function it's trying to elicit. So if oxytocin is trying to stimulate milk letdown, then it's going to bind to the myoepithelial cells in the mammary tissue. If oxytocin is trying to stimulate production of prostaglandin F2 alpha, then it is going to bind to endometrial cells in the uterus. And if oxytocin is trying to start uterine contractions, like in a parturition process, then it's going to bind to myometrial cells in the uterus. So oxytocin is a really, really diverse hormone. As we look closer at the hormones produced in the anterior pituitary, those for the most part are going to be our gonadotrope hormones, so LH and FSH. And so LH and FSH is synthesized and secreted in the anterior pituitary lobe, but they have receptors on the ovarian tissue and in the testes. So we classify LH and FSH as a gonadotropin hormone, and the gonadotrope cells produce these two hormones. And so the gonadotrope cells are a special type of cell that will produce both FSH and LH depending on the sequence of events where the female is at in the cycle and a bunch of other things that I will let you guys get into when you get into grad school. So just keep in mind that LH and FSH is stimulated by the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. And if we were in a class face to face, I would be grilling you guys on this stuff because it's really important that you have a good understanding of what hormone is produced from what tissue. And so this really kind of starts the pathway or the system of thinking that we're going to be on for the rest of the semester. So it's important to start learning these relationships. So in the hypothalamus, if we see an increase in GnRH in the blood, that GnRH is headed to the anterior pituitary gland, and we're going to see an upregulation of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, both in synthesis, and we're going to see an upregulation of its release as well. The next step is that we will see an increase of FSH and LH levels in the blood, and those hormones are then traveling towards the gonad to bind to their receptors on the gonad.